to Alaska Campmeeting. Of course, we're doing it virtually this summer because of the pandemic. But I'm wondering if you've noticed how the coronavirus really has just changed our world. It's changed our vernacular. I dare say that most of you had never heard of the IT company called Zoom a year ago, or last year at camp meeting. I'm guessing you weren't really familiar with the phrase social distancing, or perhaps the phrase that I hear more often than anything else, and that is, you're on mute. I hear that all day, every day. It's a different world. So what are we all doing as we're sheltering in place, complying to the stay-at-home orders? Well, if you are to believe the Nielsen ratings, we're all sitting at home watching Netflix. Primarily, the hit docuseries called Tiger King. I Googled Tiger King and got over 1 billion hits. According to the CEO of Netflix, it is the most watched, the most popular documentary in the history of humankind. It's quite a claim. Now, I am not in any way endorsing the series. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the Washington Post describes it this way. It is a 7-part Netflix docuseries that looks at the bizarre celebrity of zoo owner Joe Exotic, along with the entire industry of big cat breeding, that involves a cast of colorful characters and how they are all connected to one another via their obsession for big cats. Now, I understand that obsession. Again, I'm not endorsing the series. I'm just fascinated by our fascination with the topic, and I get it. I lived for a year in South Africa, almost every weekend. You could find me in Kruger National Park. Every day, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I would drive through the park in search of the big cats, lions, leopards, cheetahs, and I'm telling you, that never got old. So you can understand why I have marked in my memory the day October 3, 2003. You know how when real big news hits, you remember where you are, what you were doing. For example, 9/11, or when the Challenger exploded, or the verdict of O.J. Simpson. You probably remember these news events. For me, one of those news events, and I can tell you where I was, what I was doing, October 3, 2003. Remember what happened on that day? That marked the last show of magicians Siegfried and Roy. For over 30 years, they dominated the Strip and the entertainment capital of the world, wowing over 25 million fans with their magic show involving big cats. And after 5,000 shows with wild leopards and tigers, the unthinkable happened. October 3. Montecore, the 600-pound, 7-year-old royal white tiger, attacked Roy during a live show. Do you remember that? As soon as Roy regained consciousness, he was very fortunate to be alive. But the first thing he said was to defend the cat. Saying, "Don't kill Montecore." Montecore wasn't acting like himself that night. Something was wrong. Now, I'm no animal expert here, but it seems to me like the tiger was acting an awful lot like a tiger. And there are animal experts who would agree with me. For example, Jonathan Kraft, founder of an organization called Keepers of the Wild. He said, after the incident, the cat wasn't trying to protect Roy. That was a typical killing bite. I admire the guys. I just think that they are sending a wrong message. The message needs to be, these are wild animals. Ironically, Jonathan Kraft was attacked by one of his own Bengal tigers at his sanctuary just a year ago. At the time, Louise Dorfman, an animal behaviorist, said Siegfried's account of an accidental mauling was a beautiful story, but it just doesn't wash. Because a tiger is a tiger, and you can't tame a tiger. Now, the same principle rings true when it comes to God. Oh, we may try to domesticate the divine. We may try to control God, but we can't. In the words of Dorothy Sayers, the church has very efficiently pared the claws of the Lion of Judah, certified him meek and mild, and recommended him as a fitting household pet for pious old ladies. You can try to tame God, but you can't. The Israelites once tried, but with disastrous results. If you have a Bible handy, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 4. We're going to look today at an Old Testament story centered in the Ark of the Covenant. We're thinking together this week about the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle. The Ark of the Covenant, of course, was where God's presence was manifest among his people. So find that passage, and as you're turning there, let me give you the whole sermon in a subtitle of a book. The book is Drew Dick's book, Yawning at Titles, but here's the subtitle, the whole subject of this message. You can't tame God, so stop trying. Reading from that book. Each time a popular atheist writes a book accusing God of being mean and somehow simultaneously non-existent, we spill gallons of ink trying to defend God's actions. While I appreciate the work of apologists, this sort of enterprise often becomes a subtle way of domesticating God. I would just prefer to say, God is dangerous. He's not a house cat. He is a lion. You're free to deny his existence or pretend that he's harmless. Go ahead. Pet him if you want. Just don't expect to get your arm back. Scripture spotlights the consequences of trying to tame or control God. 1 Samuel chapter 4. A fairly lengthy passage here, so stay with me and then we will unpack it. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel as the battle spread. Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "We are in trouble. Nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the desert. Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought. And the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great, and Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Just a quick word about the Philistines. They were, of course, the hated enemy of God's people, Israelites' nemesis. They were also sometimes called the sea peoples because they believed in the old real estate axiom, location, location, location. They settled in the coastal regions, thus controlling the lucrative sea trading routes. Now, whenever they engaged in battle with the Israelites, the Philistines usually won, unless there was some divine intervention, because they had entered into a new era of warfare. Let me give you a picture of what I'm talking about here. If you look over to 1 Samuel chapter 13, we get this description. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So, on the day of the battle, no Israel soldier had a sword or a spear in his hand. In other words, the Philistines had entered the Iron Age while the Israelites were still stuck back in the Stone Age. So they would go out onto the battlefield against the Philistines, but it was like the Israelites were going up against weapons of mass destruction. All they had, slingshots and horses. So it was typically not a fair battle. And in this passage, we read about 2 specific battles. First, they go out, and at least they gave a good fight. They lost 4,000 men. They retreated, and the leaders wondered, asking the obvious question, what happened? Where was God? Why did God not protect us from the Philistines? That's when one of the commanders came up with the suggestion, I know what we'll do. Let's go back into battle against the Philistines, only this time, let's take with us the Ark of the Covenant. This was the presence of God. It's a subtle way of trying to control God, because see, now it's God's reputation on the line. The thinking was, if we drag God out onto the battlefield with us, then he has no choice. We've got him in a nice little corner. It worked for Indiana Jones against the enemy and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Why wouldn't it work for us, right? It brings to mind an old episode of The Simpsons, where Homer was fed up with all of the shameless begging for donations on a public television station. And so just for spite, he called and made a huge pledge, some astronomical sum of money that, of course, he never intended to pay. Well, the TV station tracked him down and, as punishment, sent him to go help build a church in the mission field. Not a very realistic plot, I get it, but hey, it's The Simpsons, right? So he goes on this mission trip and he works really hard, and they build this beautiful church, and at the end, he stands at a distance admiring their handiwork, and he quips to himself, I don't know much about this God, he said, but we sure have built him a nice little cage. We tend to be cage builders, don't we? We like to think, God, if I'm faithful, if I do certain things, then you have to respond in certain ways. And then we become angry sometimes with God when he doesn't answer our prayer, when he seems so distant and silent to our crying out to him, as if our prayers or our behaviors ought to somehow elicit a certain response from God. But may I remind us, we don't control God. God is God. I have recognized this theology in my own experience. I think back to my very first pastoral assignment. The conference president called me in, explained, the executive committee has voted to put you at the North Creek Church, which was confusing to me because I said, I didn't even know there was a church at North Creek. He said, well, that's the deal. There's not, but you get to start the church. I begged him not to make me do that. Followed up with nasty emails and threatening voicemails. I still remember his response. He said, Karl, I feel so honored that as your boss, you feel comfortable enough with me to share your true feelings. Thank you. Now go start the church. It was hard. It was really hard. The first Sabbath, I was preaching to my congregation, which was comprised of my wife and one other couple. That was it. In the middle of my sermon, they got up and said, really sorry, but we promised some friends we were going to go hiking with them up in the mountains, but we'll be back next week. And they left, which left me preaching to my wife, which if you're taking notes here, that is never a good idea. That never works out well. Well, it got so hard. At one point, I remember being so discouraged with this church plant. I was in our basement poring over the help wanted ads of the Seattle Times. This takes us back to an ancient era before the internet, when you would actually search for a new job by buying a newspaper. I was praying this very angry prayer, God, I am so sick of these petulant church members. I'm done. This is not what I signed up for when I went into ministry. And I was even bargaining with God, saying, I took a business major. I could have gone into business and made a lot of money. In other words, God, you're pretty lucky. I've done all of these things for you. And now, where are you? How dare you, God? I want out. I'll flip hamburgers. I'll do whatever else, but I'm not going to stay here. In the middle of this prayer, the phone rang. Keith, my head deacon, 6'4", 240 pounds. He didn't even say hello. Instead, he just said, Haffner, I know we're going through some really tough stuff right now at the church, but if you ever think about bailing on ministry, I will come break both your legs. And then he hissed, and remember, I know where you live. And with that, he hung up, didn't even say goodbye. And I returned to my prayer and I said, okay, God, all right, I get it. You're calling me to ministry. And I stayed in that church for many years, and it was a wonderful season of ministry and blessing. But I'm almost ashamed to tell that story because I recognize in myself this tendency that many of us have to bargain with God and to think that somehow our choices and our behaviors puts God in a little cage so that he has to be faithful in the way that we think he should. He has to answer our prayers as we think he ought to. And see, if we are not always completely humble before God, we might just miss out on all of the miracles that he has in mind for us. See, what if God just doesn't behave the way we think God should? What if God uses unexpected people and unpredicted events and unforeseen gifts and unlikely channels and unorthodox methods? If we are convicted in our thoughts that God listens to this kind of music and God behaves in this sort of way and God only worships in this way and God can only use this kind of a person, what if God doesn't follow our script? We might just miss out on the whole adventure. So the Israelites, they figure we've got God in a box. He's got to defend us. We've got to have victory because we've got God with us, the Ark of the Covenant. But as we read, turns out to be a disaster. We're told that every man fled from his post. They didn't even put up a battle. And so, as the story unfolds, there is a messenger that runs to the town of Shiloh to present this bad news to Eli. He runs 18 miles. At this point, Scripture tells us that Eli is an old man. He is obese and he is blind. And so he does not see the messenger coming with sackcloth and ashes. So he doesn't know that this is bad news. Now, there is a striking progression in the way that the messenger delivers the news. It goes from really bad news to even worse still, to the unthinkable. So he begins by saying to Eli, we got into a battle against the Philistines and we lost 3,000, or rather 4,000 men. Bad news. But then it gets worse. He said, we retreated and then we went back onto the battlefield. Only this time, rather than losing 4,000, we lost 30,000 men. And just when Eli figures the news can't get any darker, the messenger says, and I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but both of your sons were killed in battle. You will not have your sons as you continue to age in your sunset years of life. And then just when you think, okay, it can't get any worse than that, the bombshell. And one more thing, Eli, the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. Unimaginable. The Ark of the Covenant was captured. Now, one of the ways that a skilled storyteller in the ancient world could emphasize the most important part of the story was by sheer repetition. Of course, the author did not have at his disposal tools like font size and italics and this kind of thing to emphasize the most important parts. So they would do it simply by repetition. And here we see the most important part of the story get repeated over and over. 1 Samuel chapter 4. Over and over we find this phrase, verse 11. The Ark of the Covenant has been captured. We read it again in verse 13, verse 17, verse 19, verse 21, verse 22, over and over. Of course, the Ark of the Covenant, we're thinking about together this week, was housed in the Holy of Holies, the most holy place of the tabernacle. Nobody was allowed to enter into the most holy place of the tabernacle except for the high priest. And that was only one day out of the year, the Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur. Kippur meaning to cleanse. For this was the one day. It is a day of judgment. The Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place, it speaks to judgment. It's the one day, yes, of judgment, but it is the day of cleansing, of atonement, of mercy and grace. Yom Kippur, the highest, most holy day in the Jewish calendar. And so we get a sense in this story of just how crucial and central the Ark of the Covenant was to God's people. This comes clear from the most unlikely theologian in the story, an unnamed widow. What happens next is that the wife of Phinehas learns that her husband had been killed in that battle. She is pregnant at the time. She goes into premature labor. There is a midwife next to her trying to encourage her, saying things like, all hope is not lost. Hang in there. You're about to give birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. Just hang in there. But instead, she gives birth, and then she declares his name will be Ichabod. Then she rolls over and dies. His name will be Ichabod. The greatest word, I think, in all of the Hebrew language is kabod. Really, if we were to capture the essence of our theme at the camp meeting this summer in one Hebrew word, it would be Chabad. It's the presence of God. But wherever there is Chabad, there is hope. Why? Because that's God. But she doesn't name him Chabad. She names him Ichabod. Now, in the Hebrew, if you put an I in front of some words, it renders it to mean just the opposite. We have something similar in the English language. If you put an A in front of some words, it renders them to mean just the opposite, such as the opposite of typical is what? Atypical. Opposite of theist is an atheist. In Hebrew, it's an I. So what she says is his name will be Ichabod. In other words, the presence of God has departed. In other words, there is no hope. The glory of God is gone. There's no reason to live. Rabbi Harold Kushner in this quote points out the irony that we see in the story that at the end of the day, the greatest security comes in the presence of this very unsafe God. He illustrates it this way. He writes, the next time you go to the zoo, notice where the lines are longest. We find ourselves irresistibly drawn to the tigers and the lions. Why? I suspect that without realizing it or understanding it, we are strangely reassured at seeing creatures bigger and stronger than ourselves, creatures we did not make and who are not subject to our control. It gives us the message, at once humbling and comforting, that we are not the ultimate power. Oh, we desperately crave the reassuring reminder that ultimately mankind is not in charge, that we serve this God that is absolutely beyond our ability to control. I think of that iconic scene, you probably remember it from the Chronicles of Narnia, where Mr. and Mrs. Beaver are escorting the children to visit Aslan, the lion, the Christ figure of the story. And this is for the very first time. The kids are going to meet the lion, and little Lucy confides in Mrs. Beaver. She said, I'm really nervous about this. Oh, that you will be, Mrs. Beaver said. Anybody who can stand in the presence of Aslan the lion without their knees trembling is just plain silly. Really, said Lucy. So then he isn't safe? Safe, barked Mr. Beaver. Safe? Of course he isn't safe. He's the lion, I tell you. He is not safe, but he is good. Our God is not safe, but he is good. So what do you do when your name is Ichabod? When you wonder, God, why are you so silent to my prayers? Why are you so distant and far removed from my story? What do you do? Well, there are no 6 simple steps to recapturing the glory of God in the story. This is not some simple formula. The words of an old song come to mind: when you can't trace God's hand, trust his heart. What do we do when we feel like God has forgotten and forsaken us? Well, when we can't understand what he's doing, when we can't trace his hand, we can trust his heart, and we can know that God is good, and that ultimately all things will work out for those who love and just lean into him. And so I say, hang on. Lean into faith. Don't let go of God as you're going through the inevitable chapters of loss and hardship in life. Hang on, because who knows? Maybe your story will end similarly to the story of the Israelites, because what God does next in this story, you can hardly imagine. See, God allows the Philistines to capture his presence, the Ark of the Covenant. They then parade down Main Street, a long parade, people spitting and mocking and taunting this God of Israel. You understand, this is telling us a little bit about the true nature of God's glory, the kind of God we serve. This is a foreshadowing of the day when God would come again, only he would not be in the Ark of the Covenant, but he would come in bodily form, a new covenant. And John would proclaim, we beheld his kabod, his glory, but we didn't recognize it because he didn't look or act anything like the kind of God we imagined him to be. He came with no power, no title, no position, no army. And then at the end of a rather insipid life, he becomes a prisoner. And they parade him down Main Street. And they start mocking him and taunting him and spitting on him. What kind of a God would allow people to do this to him? And then they put him on a cross, and he dies. Pilate then puts him in a box. I don't know much about this God of Israel, but I sure have built him a nice little cage. But Pilate was seriously underestimating this God, for he will not be put in a little box. He will not be manipulated or controlled. And at the appointed hour, he exploded out of that box. And because he did, now we have this hope and this power and strength to live in the presence of this magnificent, albeit totally untamable God.